Historic patterns of church growth. Every cultural situation is unique, so the growth of every church is unique. But there are some basic principles that have held true over history as far as the growth of churches. We can see some patterns that emerge when we study historical churches through the ages and how they've grown. These are some of those patterns. The ideas of this lecture were taken from a book called The Historical Patterns of Church Growth by Harold C. Cook, published by Moody Press, Chicago in 1971. He examines the culture throughout history and discovers 5 churches which typify growth and pulls his patterns from these churches. The first is the Armenian Church in Armenia, the Irish Church, the Hawaiian Church, the Karen Church in Burma, and the Batak Church in Sumatra. The conclusions he reaches are as follows. First of all, you have to recognize the uniqueness of each situation. There is no one strategy for church growth that works for all people in all times. Situations for churches are as varied as snowflakes. Second, he says, reach the leaders and the others will follow. Every church wants to penetrate the cultural barriers needed, and the way you do that is by reaching out to the leaders of those cultures. Don't assume that because you have the members from another culture or another race in your church that you have a gateway into that culture that is going to produce more. You need to go for the leaders of a culture. Each culture has a unique set of leaders. Sometimes those leaders are legitimate leaders, such as politicians, parents, teachers, and union leaders. But they may also include illegitimate leaders, such as ringleaders of gangs, troublemakers, people who cause problems, and revolutionaries can be those leaders. There's also the influential leaders, such as teachers, artists, celebrities, and musicians. So look for the leaders when you're trying to reach a community of people. Third, he says, be a folk religion. Now, by folk religion, we mean a religion that fits in with the culture. Churches grow when they make them part of the social culture around them. We all come from a specific cultural group, and we see from within that cultural perspective. In order to grow beyond that cultural perspective, we must set aside our own prejudice and embrace a new culture. This doesn't simply include the major cultural divisions, such as race or class, but also many minor divisions within those cultural divisions that can provide barriers to church growth. Those are subcultures, countercultures that are against the culture, and microcultures, cultures existing in the small part within another culture. Now, how do we adopt the folk nature of a church? Well, we do it in several ways. One of the ways is by using culturally sensitive music. If you're reaching out to urban people, use urban music. If you're reaching to country people, use country music. Adapt your musical taste and style to the people. Don't insist on them liking what you like. Another way is culturally appropriate dress. Do not dress in a way that will offend the dress code of the culture you are in. Church is not a time for teaching manners or fashion sense. Make your dress inoffensive and inappropriate to the people you're speaking to. Third, you can use social events of the culture to carry out spiritual values. Those include things like Mother's Day, Father's Day, Valentine's Day, that are not necessarily Christian, but they do provide an opportunity for us to draw non-Christians into church values and into Christian values. We should use the cultural traditions they have. Use the language and the symbols of a culture to teach Christian values. Many of the concepts that we use in the church every day were really drawn from the culture around it. Words like lordship, discipleship, even the family of God are based on symbols that we used out of our cultures that existed before Christianity so that we could communicate them. St. Patrick, for example, in Ireland took the shamrock, which is a symbol of pagan Ireland, and used it to explain the Trinity, so it became a Christian symbol. Finally, use community needs and recognize them. Does your church have a lot of hunger? and poverty? Set up a hunger ministry. Is there a need for financial management? Use financial management to reach the lost. Does it need health care? Use health care to reach the lost. Cultural barriers become bridges to cross. Cultural needs become bridges to cross cultural barriers. Keep in mind that every community has many microcultures within it. We may be called to build a church to a particular microculture that has particular needs. Our cultural choices must be consistent with the microculture, not just the major culture, but the microculture we are trying to reach. Fourth, learn to adapt church structures to meet a new culture. What works structurally in one culture will not work in another. An authoritarian approach to a church will not work in a democratic cultural environment. Neither can we expect to build in a church where the culture is top-down leadership. We can't expect it to become purely congregational. We must adapt our methods and our ways to culturally appropriate ways. The government of the church reflects the government of the culture at large. Let me give you some examples. The Roman Catholic Church, which was the first church to emerge in the West after Christian persecution ended, adopted a structure of authority that it derived from the Roman Empire. It had one supreme head called the Pope, which was similar to the emperor. It had cardinals and bishops that were similar to the officials that worked under the emperor. It even used many terms borrowed from the Roman government, such as diocese and legates. In Scotland, however, where central authority was debated and questioned and doubted, and tribal chiefs were the leaders, they adopted a Presbyterian form of government, which was ruled by elders. This suited the culture of the Scottish Church very, very well. However, when the Scottish Church came to America on the frontier, where the pioneers were individualists and distrusted all authority, the Baptist method of congregational government seemed to work better. They rejected the Presbyterianism in favor of a more independent style. In every culture, there needs to be an understanding of what kind of structure suits best that time and place. The fourth concept is being firm in the face of paganism. While we adapt to the culture, we do not bend our foundational values. Churches must sustain growth over generations by sustaining a separate existence from the rest of the world around it. They must rely on biblically based values and not on worldly values. They will not compromise God's eternal decrees for a temporary membership gain. The results of doing otherwise is a watered-down, ineffective kind of Christianity that does not convert the world, but inoculates it against the gospel. Before the church can begin to grow, it must determine what its true values are and not compromise. Sexual immorality, racial prejudice, and moral laxity will not build the church. The world must recognize Christians as different in life and witness from the rest of the world, even if it costs them short-term membership gains. The fifth principle is that members make disciples. You can't expect the church to grow without the people of God believing in the gospel to the point that they will tell others. There has to be an intentional approach to growth. Programs and movements are helpful in growing a church, but only temporarily. Once a movement fades, it's the careful cultivation of individual people, leading them to lead others to Jesus, that really makes the difference. This outreach does not rise to the level of what we usually call personal evangelism. It is more really an invitation to evangelism. They invite people to church. They see that there's a need in their lives, and they go out and tell others. Sheep make sheep, not shepherds. The best evangelists are not the most trained or eloquent people. They are the people who make friends with others and invite them to come along into their lives. In the end, it's those contacts that make the real difference in a church. As you prepare to be pastors, mission developers, and other missionaries and others that are developing churches, one of the things that you need to understand is the culture that you're dealing with. You need to be able to learn how to adapt your work, both structurally and culturally, to fit the patterns of the people around you. This isn't so that you can compromise with culture, but this is so that you can overcome the resistance that culture is. Think of culture as the Tower of Babel. In order to get beyond that Babel, you need to learn to speak many languages. And the Word of God is useful in every language. And whatever language you speak, you can learn to speak another. You can learn to communicate to another culture. Even within your own culture, there are many other cultures within it. Learn to adapt and learn to be flexible, but never compromise the Word of God.
As you prepare to be pastors, mission developers, and other missionaries,